Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, right off the bat, I'll have to apologize for my voice this week because I've been sick over the last week and, well, this is the best I got. However, I definitely have to put up a video because I missed my live stream during the week and YouTube punishes you if you don't follow a schedule. So today I'm going to talk about high fantasy versus low fantasy. And I actually wanted to do this as part of the live stream for the week because I wanted it to be much more of a discussion and have you as the audience actually put stuff in the chat questioning what I have to say or contradicting it, whatever. But I'm really not up for a stream right now, and this way I can actually stop and start. And really, the reason why I wanted to talk about this subject was because I'm writing my new book, the next one that's going to come out, which is CROM the Destroyer, and it's a low fantasy story. And not only that, but I would say it is a return to form for low fantasy. That's what I'm trying to accomplish with this. And by the way, you're looking at the art, some of the art for CROM the Destroyer in the background. The early bird sign up page link is in the description. If you want to go over there and sign up, you'll get an email when the project goes live. I have that scheduled for the 4th of July. Plus, you'll get a free exclusive pinup poster if you sign up early. And also, the links are in the description for my 2 superhero graphic novels, which you can take a look at and see if you want to order. And again, since this is going to be something I should have done on a live stream, I'm not actually going to present a very strict argument like I usually do. I'm just going to go over a lot of different points and then try to pull them together at the end. And I'd like, again, for you to discuss in the comments or even just leave me a comment directly so that we can talk about this in a roundabout way. So I'm going to be talking about both science fiction and fantasy in terms of low fantasy and high fantasy. I think you can categorize even science fiction into those two. And that's because of the basic definition of what is the difference between low fantasy and high fantasy. Low fantasy is typically characterized by being in this world, our world, and according to the basic rules of our world. Whereas high fantasy is thought of usually as being in a different world, one that we are not used to, which has rules of its own for various different things. And the big examples for each is that Tolkien represents high fantasy. Robert E. Howard represents low fantasy. Now, first off, I'm going to say right here that there's overlap between the two. These rules are not hard and fast. Quite honestly, even with those two great examples, there's overlap. For Tolkien, anyways, I would say, and this is just me, I never heard anyone else talk about it in these terms, but for me, anyways, I kind of think of Tolkien as being low fantasy. No one agrees with me on that, but the point is that he's basically writing a mythology for England or the British Isles. That's what he said he was doing to begin with. So I would set it in this world. And I would look at all of the things that everyone says, these are the rules of the world that he lays down, all of this mythology. This is how the world works. And I'd say, no, this is the mythology that the people who are the characters within the world think about when they're writing their own mythology, when they're thinking about their own world and how they exist in it that long time ago. So it's just mythology. All you're looking at is mythology. To me, it seems like it could be interpreted as low fantasy. But again, I'm really alone in thinking this. But let's look at Robert E. Howard and see him as a low fantasy story. And most likely everyone thinks of Conan as being the stereotypical low fantasy story. But at the same time, if you look at some of Howard's works, like The Tower of the Elephant, which I think has a very good first act and second act, but really falls down and almost destroys the entire Conan universe with the third act, you have an alien basically describing an intergalactic war, which could even be an interdimensional war, which he then fled to Earth. So this story would put it in the category of high fantasy if you take all of that as being true. So again, there is some overlap, although I don't think that overlap is a really good idea. If someone's there for low fantasy, give them low fantasy. If someone's there for high fantasy, give them high fantasy. When you try to mix the two, you have problems. Now let's go over a couple of other examples that come to my mind anyway, and see how this plays out. Let's look at science fiction for a minute. I would say your typical low fantasy for science fiction would be Star Trek, and your typical high fantasy for science fiction would be Star Wars. And you could easily see that if in Star Wars suddenly they discovered the Earth, like Battlestar Galactica, I think most of the fans would be pretty miffed. And at the same time, if you took Star Trek and added into it the Force, I really don't think that would play well with the fans for Star Trek. And why? Well, because, of course, that breaks the definition of what low fantasy and high fantasy is. If you're doing it in our world with basically science as its basis, which is what Star Trek is, and you enter into this equation basically a mystical force that has no explanation, no real explanation, then yeah, you're mixing high fantasy and low fantasy, and that wouldn't work. Or at the same time, if you do the exact opposite and take this giant fantasy world and insert the Earth into it, which is much more grounded, then you're going to have a problem because it takes low fantasy and it sticks it right in the face of high fantasy, so it doesn't work. Now, there are some examples of storytellers trying to merge the two. If you take a look at the Riddick trilogy of movies, really, the first movie is low fantasy. The second movie is, well, I would say a combination of both low fantasy and high fantasy. It's basically two movies squished into one. The prison planet part of it is low fantasy. Then you have the necromongers and their conquering of the universe or destruction of this reality. That's high fantasy. Most people don't like that movie. I actually do like that movie. A lot of people would say they should have stuck to one and not both at the same time. You can't have it both ways. And just to complete that thought, the third movie was basically a rehashing of the first movie, which is low fantasy, with a couple of high fantasy things around the edges. And the next movie is supposed to be the high fantasy part of it. So they basically took those two things and just separated them like everybody wanted them to do for the second movie. But anyway, so off the top of my head, I can think of only really one group of stories that actually worked at incorporating both high fantasy and low fantasy into it. And again, this would be science fiction, and that would be the X-Files. And no, I don't mean the new X-Files. I don't care about the new X-Files. I mean the old X-Files shows. You had low fantasy when you had these small little stories about these things that would happen in our world that they were trying to track down. And then you would switch to high fantasy stories where it involved these aliens and the fate of the entire universe, or at the very least the planet. And the only reason why I think that even remotely worked was because of the format within which it was presented. The stories really didn't overlap within every episode. They were separate episodes. You had to watch one episode and then the next. And also, it came out on television, whereas you had to wait for the next episode. I don't even think it would work today in a binge-watching television milieu that we have right now. Even if you separated the episodes into low fantasy and high fantasy, having the ability to watch them one after the other and not having that gap of a week minimum in between would just be too much whiplash. And you can see this by how bad the movies were, if you ask me. They fell down severely. Why? Because they had to concentrate on one or the other. And the thing is that when you move into high gear for high fantasy, you really can't move back to low fantasy. Again, the only reason why X-Files could do it to begin with was because they compartmentalized these different kinds of stories by the way the stories were told within the weekly presentation in the television that existed at that time. So to continue on from there, I want to talk about one part of fantasy that actually helps explain the difference between high fantasy and low fantasy. And that would be something like a system independent working within these worlds. And the biggest system that is usually used is magic. Now, the establishing of a magic system within high fantasy is just exactly that. It's a system. You have to understand how it works, and you have to be able to translate that to the mind of the reader so that the reader can understand what's going on as well. So it's a very regular, systematized way of putting down your magic and how it works. But within low fantasy, it's much more of a guessing game. You don't know exactly how this thing works. And I want to talk about that for a moment with two different books that were written for the Conan universe, not by Robert E. Howard, but later on. There's two books that have different ways of describing magic within the Conan universe. I think one works and one does not. For me, the one that does not work within the Conan universe is Conan the Destroyer, which was written by Robert Jordan. Sure, you have this wizard who sometimes uses these arcane symbols and things in order to create magic, but at the same time, he also has, which is basically typical magical abilities, which is to say he waves his hands around in a weird way and says some arcane things, and all of a sudden fireballs erupt from his hands. To me, that says there's a regularized system that can be used, and that's hinting at high fantasy, not low fantasy. That's why it doesn't work within this Conan story. But if you look at something else, like Conan the Liberator, which I think was written by L. Sprague de Camp, you have this wizard, which is the main protagonist in this entire story, and his wizardry, his magic, it doesn't work sometimes. And even when it does work, you got to question yourself as, is this really magic? I don't know if this is actually magic. The opening scene itself is this wizard trying to do this experiment on the king, and it doesn't actually work. The magic doesn't work. And then within the rest of the book, you have stuff like he has a chariot and a horse that seem like they're automatons. They could be golems, they could be magical, it could be metal brought to life, or it could just be he has a mechanical horse. He also uses things like force fields. He also uses illusion. In one point, he tries to get away, and it looks like, according to his own saying, he's going to disappear and transport himself into another land completely, but all he does is uses some illusion to make it look like he disappeared, and then he goes and he finds his mechanical horse and they take off. So again, is it magic? Is it illusion? Or the fact that he spies on Conan by this device, which to me doesn't sound like magic at all. He has this magic mirror where he can watch things that happen, and there's a part of the mirror that breaks off, which he gives to a beautiful woman, which attaches herself to Conan, and he can hear the transmissions from that piece of the mirror, which is, again, transmitted back to his original starting point. So to me, it sounds like he has a basic weird television and is using radio signals in order to transmit it from one place to another. You could say, yeah, it's magic, or you could say, yeah, it's science. It doesn't actually answer these questions, nor does it even try to answer these questions. To me, that's classical low fantasy. And that's why, for my own book, which is CROM the Destroyer, which you're looking at in the background, the quote-unquote magic that you see there is not actually explained and could be many different things. I always leave it open to interpretation. There can be many different explanations for what is going on. I actually think that takes some respect for the reader to do that, because the reader gets to fill in those blanks. First off, we're in a world where superpowers actually exist, because this is the prehistory of the Thomas Valiant universe. Therefore, is it magic? Or does this guy simply have superpowers? Or, like Tolkien, like X-Files, there is a spiritual component to the universe. Therefore, is it spirituality or is it magic? Also, there's a bunch of stuff about electricity. Is it magic or is it science? Simply science that they shouldn't have at this point. Plus, there's a whole lot of illusion being used. So again, is it magic? Is it illusion? Most people would look at our ability to project things into the air right now, which is massive, and look at that and say, that's magic. 100 years ago, that would be seen as magic. Now we just see it as something we can do with light. And the kicker, of course, being, is this something that the wizard is claiming that he did, but didn't actually do? Is he lying? Is the person telling the story actually telling you the truth, or are they just telling you what they believe? Sometimes people are wrong. And that leads into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, the difference between high fantasy and low fantasy. Again, typically, if you have high fantasy, you're going to have a bunch of characters, and you're probably going to have multiple perspectives, and more times than not, an omnipotent storyteller. That is to say, narrator. Why? Because if you just have one person and his one perspective, and you're trying to explain the entire world and all of its systems through their perspective, is it real? You really can't do that. You can't actually explore all of those things because one person doesn't understand all of those things. If they do, they're not going to have a very good character arc because they're already all knowing so that they can give you all of that knowledge as the reader. So typically for high fantasy, you're going to get, again, all of these large casts, different perspectives, omnipotent narrator, all that kind of thing. But for low fantasy, it's quite the opposite. Typically, you're going to get very few, if not just one person that you're going to get the perspective of, and it's how they see the universe. And on top of that, you're going to get a narrator which doesn't know everything. And with the mix of those things, then the world becomes much more what we are used to in our normal everyday existence. I walk around in my normal everyday life assuming I know what's going on with everything, because if I didn't, I really couldn't move forward with a lot of stuff I'm trying to do. But I know that I don't know everything. I know that some of that is wrong. I'm just working off the best information that I have. And that's the kind of thing that you get with low fantasy. And I'm sure low fantasy probably drives editors insane because editors want a regularized system. They'll say, if you're going to set this up, you're going to have to explain it to the reader. And with high fantasy, that works great. But within low fantasy, you're saying to your editor, hey, look, see, this is something unexplained because no one knows what's going on here. We're just going to leave it. And I'm sure that must drive editors insane. But at the same time, it's very natural. It's very much the way that the world exists around us. And that leads into a kind of story and storytelling that focuses on that one individual, and that's it. It doesn't matter about the world around them. It doesn't matter about other characters. This is the way the Robert E. Howard Conan stories are written. You have things like, what? You're going to leave it there? How are you going to end the story there? You have a guy who just got his head chopped off. Then he gets up and starts running around in circles. And you're going to end the story there. Yeah, he's going to end the story there. Why? Because that's the last that that character has to do with Conan, and the story's about Conan. So it doesn't matter whatever happens to this guy after this point. The story about Conan is over. Now, I want to stop there for just a minute, but I want to bring those things back at the end because a lot of what I just said is very important. For a second, I want to look at Marvel and how they actually destroy their own storytelling by trying to mix high fantasy and low fantasy. And I think this works for the comics as well as for the MCU right now. Now, I have the greatest respect for Jim Shooter because I think he really built Marvel Comics, or at the very least was one of the key figures to build Marvel Comics into the great thing that it was within the 80s and the 90s. But at the same time, he also planted the seed for its destruction. And I don't mean the quote-unquote progressive destruction we see around us today. The destruction I'm talking about has been there for quite some time and was in the downfall of Marvel Comics in the late 90s, early 2000s. Because Marvel was supposed to be the world outside your window. And yeah, they tried to use that still today. That's a bunch of nonsense today. I'm sorry, but what they're presenting in the Marvel Comics today is definitely not the world outside the reader's window. It's the world outside the person who lives in New York with rose-colored progressive glasses on window, and that's it. And no, it's not the window of the world either, because progressivism is rejected by most of the world. Anyway, I'm not getting into that today. So the point is that the original idea of the world outside your window was low fantasy. The stories from Marvel Comics were low fantasy. And so you could have all of these different stories with different characters in basically the same universe, which is just a copy of our world. And so low fantasy ensues. You didn't have to explain all of the connections. You didn't have to regularize the systems that were used. You just wrote stories. And the real beginning of the end for that was Secret Wars, and the equivalent for that in DC, which would be Crises on Infinite Earths. Once you have this world-shattering or universe-shattering event, which has to tie in everybody and all the characters and every story and have all of these connections through tie-ins, which people have to read and all that kind of thing, you've just moved from low fantasy into high fantasy. Why? Well, because of all the things I've just been talking about. You take a story which is typically focused on one individual and the way that he sees the world, and it exists completely separate and really has no bearing on the story you're telling, and you smush that together with all of the other characters who are in a similar universe, then everybody has to operate under the same systems. The individuals don't matter anymore. You have these multiple perspectives. You have all of these things coming together under systematized ways of acting, especially if you're going to have tie-ins, and it becomes high fantasy. And as I mentioned, this is the same thing that just happened to the MCU. Once you get to that point of a world-shattering event, there's nothing but downhill from there. You can move on to universe-shattering event, which they did in the MCU, and it can work, but most of the time it doesn't work. Why? Well, go back to your good form of Aristotelian storytelling. It is not proportional. Once you start getting into a scale where most people don't really have the ability to wrap their minds around the entire thing which is at stake, then you lose people. It's not a good story because it's not a beautiful story, because it's not proportional, because the proportions are so large that the person reading can't actually see the entire thing. But again, this is the problem with the MCU. This is the problem with the Marvel Comics, has been for quite some time. And this is the problem with so many science fiction and fantasy stories, especially on television. Once they get to that point of a world-shattering or universe-shattering event that your heroes save the day for, then it's all downhill from there. And for several reasons. But the reasons all revolve around the fact that you just moved from low fantasy to high fantasy. And if you've drawn in an audience through low fantasy, they want low fantasy. They don't want high fantasy. So you're going to actually destroy the initial basis of why the people are there to begin with. And that's why Marvel Comics, even if this quote-unquote progressive nonsense weren't there right now, would probably be mostly garbage. Why? Because they have like 3-4 world-shattering events every year, which ties in the entire universe, and then they tried to go back with the individual titles to low fantasy. That doesn't work. Why should I care what Daredevil feels and what he's going through in his life if 3 times a year the entire world could end? It doesn't matter. And at the same time, if the world does end, you can't have Daredevil still fighting crime in Hell's Kitchen. It doesn't work. Most people would answer that by saying, well, you know the world's not going to end, therefore you concentrate still on the stories of those people. Well, if the world isn't going to end, and I know that from the get-go, then these events are just a bunch of nonsense. Get rid of them. But again, they can't get rid of them because they started it off with Secret Wars, and they had to try to top that again and again and again and again. Which, as I said, is moving from low fantasy to high fantasy, and you've just lost the entire basis of why most people came to enjoy these stories to begin with. Sure, it might be a great way to give a topping off of the entire story that will possibly excite the fan base to no end, but then you just destroyed your entire fan base. So unless you're planning to not publish any more stories after that point, you just shot yourself not only in the foot, but in the face. Okay, so now I want to move into the reason why I was thinking about this to begin with. And it's another thing that has to do with fantasy in general and the difference between high fantasy and low fantasy. Now, as a person who is a writer and has been a writer for a long time and wanted to be a writer for a long time, I noticed these patterns throughout my life. That whenever really bad things happen in the world, you have an explosion of fantasy stories at the same time. Why? Because it seems like people want to escape from this world into another because they just can't handle what's going on right here, right now. So just off the top of my head, economic crash in the 80s, yeah, fantasy stories took off. It became obviously clear to everyone that the United States was just now bogged down in Middle Eastern wars, yeah, fantasy stories took off. Now, I'll have to add at this point, and I never really considered this up until the last couple of years, but it seems more and more like it might have some relevance. How much of that is people actually wanting those fantasy stories? And how much is that the people who control the entertainment system saying, yeah, we've been told on high from various organizations that we need to distract the people. Quick, roll out all the fantasy stories so that they're concerned with other worlds and not this one. Again, I never really considered that until the last couple of years. I think that might actually be partly the case. But again, partly the case because people actually want to be distracted when things get really bad. Now, in addition to that, I would say there's two kinds of people that want these kinds of fantasy stories when things start to go bad. Number one are the people who want to retreat so far into fantasy that they replace reality with fantasy. For those people, there's no helping them. They just want to live in a fantasy world. This is what your quote-unquote progressive people do all the time. Other than that, if you have a regular person who is a normal person who knows they have to deal with this world, they want these fantasy stories in hard times because it gives their mind some kind of rest. It allows you to leave the cares of this world and actually go and just live in another world for this short amount of time. Again, gives you some mental rest. Now, the thing is that I took this observation that I made over my own life, and I started to apply it to history over the last 100 years or more, and see where the rise of these fantasy stories would take place according to bad things happening within usually world history. And I could see that it not only happens that way, but the fact that the worse the situation gets, the more likely the people are to be attracted to low fantasy rather than high fantasy. And why? Well, I would say there are probably several reasons why. Number one being that for high fantasy, when you have to establish all of this new world and new rules, that takes a lot of time. And if people are struggling to survive, you don't have a lot of time in order to be gallivanting off to this other world to learn how things work there. It just doesn't work that way. While at the same time, low fantasy gives you the ability to go into another fantastical world with the rules, which are basically the same as here, so you don't have to have a whole lot of backstory. And at the same time, as I said, because it's usually about one person and their journey through this world, then it is much easier to connect not only to the person, but to the things that that person needs to overcome, which then in turn gives you as an individual some ammunition about how to deal with the problems in your own life, much more than you would get from high fantasy. And anything that you can use to make your life better when things go horribly, horribly bad is something to grab onto. And that brings me to where I want to conclude this entire thing. It's the fact that I was writing superhero graphic novels. That's what I thought would be the mainstay of what I would want to do over the next 10 years or more. But I always wanted to do a Robert E. Howard kind of Conan story, which is what you see with my book, CROM, the Destroyer, which, again, you're looking at in the background. But quite honestly, I was not prepared for how well received the idea of the story, because I haven't even got the story out yet, but just the simple idea of this story would be to people. Quite honestly, I'm at the point now where I don't know which is going to be the story of prominence moving forward. Is it going to be the superhero stuff? Is it going to be the fantasy stuff? They both exist in the same world within vastly different amounts of time, and I'm going to continue to do both, but one's going to be dominant. And I can't say which one of those it's going to be anymore. I thought it would be the superhero stuff. It doesn't appear like that's going to be the case right now. Again, I could be wrong. And again, part of the reason why I don't know which one is going to be the dominant anymore is because that's going to be up to the audience. But more to the point is that we see the destruction of storytelling and so many properties around us today with this quote-unquote progressive nonsense that is being shoved in sideways to everything that we consume as mainstream entertainment. But at the same time, we now have indie entertainment that is past the point of getting its footing and starting to push into actual fandoms of their own. And if we want to keep this momentum up, I think low fantasy is the way to go. And that's for several reasons. Number one, things are starting to get pretty hard out there. We're looking at possibly the same kind of environment that Robert E. Howard started to write his Conan stories in, which would be the dirty 30s. If that's the case, again, as I just talked about, it is people going to be glomming on to low fantasy because they want something to escape to that doesn't take a lot of time, it doesn't take a lot of effort, but just may give them that extra oomph of inspiration to keep on going in their own life or to tackle their own problems. And at the same time, what the heck is progressivism to begin with except for high fantasy? That's what it is. These people make up their own language, their own way of using our language that we use in our normal everyday life. They add all of these things into it and say all of these systems are how the world operates. Yeah, you've just made up a system of high fantasy, a bad system of high fantasy, but that's all you've done. And you're trying to impose it on our world. People are getting sick of that, and it's translating, I think, to high fantasy as well. Because, again, that's what it is. Progressivism is just high fantasy. And what are people going to do in order to continue to have good stories? They're going to flee to low fantasy. And that's just another way of saying that if we wish to defeat this quote-unquote progressive monolith of entertainment that we see everywhere around us today, all we have to do is dig in our heels and focus on the gritty, real, ultimately human way of looking at story and life. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And as I said, the links are in the description for the early bird sign-up page for CROM the Destroyer if you want that free poster when you go and order from the campaign. Also, you can get my 2 graphic novels, order them from the links in the description as well. And I think, just as a kicker to the end of this video, I'm going to play the first trailer for CROM the Destroyer. You've probably been looking at it in the background without any sound, but I'll play it with sound for you here now. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.
An age ago, the beating heart of our people was a king who knew only victory. He wanted nothing more than an honorable death on the battlefield. Yet, none could match him, and so he wandered the earth, becoming lost in time and tide. Then we too lost our honest purpose, while silk-clad men sat upon the throne. But tremble now, all cities that lay under the stars, for out of the shadows and mists of the land of promise, our courage has been rekindled, our heart has returned, and the world will burn.